The champagne flutes shattered against Italian marble as Marcus Chen watched his wife of 6 years stumble backward, her hand instinctively protecting the 7-month swell of her belly. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Malibu mansion, each drop a tiny explosion against glass that cost more than most people's cars. "Get out," he said, his voice cold as the December storm raging outside. "I want you gone before Sienna arrives." Elena Chen, born Elena Reyes, though she'd buried that name deep, stared at her husband with something between disbelief and recognition. She'd known this was coming. Had felt it building for months in the way Marcus looked through her instead of at her, in the late-night phone calls he took in his study, in the expensive lingerie receipts for sizes she'd never worn. "Marcus, I'm 7 months pregnant with your child." Her voice stayed level despite the trembling in her hands. "You can't just, I can do whatever I want." He stepped closer, his Armani suit perfect despite the late hour, despite the rage radiating from him like heat. "This is my house. My money. My life. And you're nothing but a gold digger who trapped me with a pregnancy." The accusation should have hurt more than it did. But Elena had grown a thick skin during their marriage, learning to absorb his casual cruelties the way their marble floors absorbed the champagne now pooling at her feet. "I never asked you for anything," she said quietly. "I worked at the museum when we met. I had my own life. A pathetic life. A nothing life." Marcus pulled out his phone, typing something with sharp, angry movements. "My lawyers have prepared divorce papers. You'll sign them tonight, take whatever I decide to give you, and disappear. Preferably before my daughter is born so she doesn't have to be embarrassed by her mother's humble origins." Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not pain, she'd moved past pain weeks ago when she'd first confirmed what her gut had been screaming. This was something colder, sharper. Something that tasted like clarity. "Your daughter," she repeated. "You mean the child you haven't attended a single doctor's appointment for? The child whose nursery I've been preparing alone while you've been sleeping with your PR director?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Sienna understands my world. She gets the pressure, the expectations, the need for a partner who can navigate high society without embarrassing me at every fundraiser and gallery opening. I have a master's degree in art history from Princeton, Marcus. I speak 4 languages. I've never embarrassed you. You embarrass me by existing." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep. "You're not sophisticated enough, not connected enough, not wealthy enough to be the wife of Marcus Chen. I made a mistake marrying you, and I'm correcting it." The front door opened, and Sienna Whitmore swept in wearing a white dress that probably cost what Elena's mother made in 3 months as a housekeeper. At 32, Sienna had the kind of polished beauty that came from a lifetime of personal trainers, dermatologists, and the absolute certainty that the world would rearrange itself to suit her preferences. "Oh good," Sienna said brightly, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're still here. I was worried we'd have to track you down at some women's shelter." She turned to Marcus, sliding her arm through his with practiced ease. "Darling, did you tell her about the prenup?" Elena's stomach clenched. "What prenup?" "The one you signed 3 days before our wedding," Marcus said, pulling folded papers from his jacket pocket. "The one that clearly states you waive all claims to my assets, my property, and my income in the event of divorce." Elena stared at the documents he thrust toward her, recognizing her signature at the bottom of pages she'd never actually read. She'd been so in love, so excited about the wedding, so eager to prove she wasn't marrying him for money that she'd signed without question when his lawyers had presented them. "I was entitled to have my own attorney review that," she said quietly. "And you chose not to. Your mistake." Marcus's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "The prenup stands. You get nothing except what I choose to give you out of the goodness of my heart." Sienna laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. "Goodness of his heart. That's rich." "Marcus, darling, you're being too generous. She should leave with exactly what she brought to this marriage, nothing." Elena watched them together, Marcus and his mistress, and felt the last threads of whatever affection she'd clung to finally snap. 7 years ago, she'd walked away from her family, from her father's world of power and influence, determined to make her own way. She'd changed her name, hidden her background, worked minimum wage jobs to put herself through graduate school because she wanted to prove she could succeed on her own merit. And she'd fallen in love with Marcus Chen, the self-made tech billionaire who'd built an empire from a college dorm room. Or at least, that's what the press releases said. The reality, she'd learned, was considerably less romantic. Marcus's empire had been built on stolen code, suppressed competitors, and enough legal gray areas to make her lawyer father's blood boil. Her lawyer father. The thought made Elena's lips curve into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The prenup entitles me to nothing," she said slowly. "Is that what you're telling me?" Finally, she understands. Sienna beamed at Marcus. "See, darling? I told you this would be easier than you thought." "But I do get custody of our daughter," Elena continued, her hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked as if responding to her mother's rising fury. "The prenup says nothing about children, which means California law applies. And California is very generous to mothers, especially mothers whose husbands committed adultery during their pregnancy." Marcus's expression darkened. "You'll take whatever custody arrangement I offer, or I'll make sure you never see her at all. I have resources you can't imagine, Elena. Lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast." "People like me," Elena repeated. "You mean people who come from nothing? People who don't have powerful connections or family money?" "Exactly." Marcus grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to bruise. "You're a nobody from nowhere, and you're about to learn what happens when nobodies try to fight people like me." Elena looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. For 6 years, she'd made herself small for this man. She'd hidden who she was, downplayed her intelligence, accepted his casual cruelties because she believed in the fairy tale of their love story. The poor girl who'd won the heart of the billionaire prince. But fairy tales were lies, and she was done pretending. "Let go of me, Marcus." Something in her tone made him release her arm. Sienna stepped back slightly, confusion flickering across her perfect features. "I'll sign your divorce papers," Elena said quietly. "I'll take whatever settlement you think is fair. But understand this, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. And you have no idea what's coming." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. "Is that a threat? Are you threatening me?" "I'm making you a promise." Elena moved toward the stairs, her movements careful despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You wanted me gone before Sienna moved in? Fine. I'll be gone in an hour. But Marcus?" She paused on the bottom step, looking back at the man she'd loved enough to hide her entire identity for. "My name isn't Elena Reyes. It's Elena Reyes Chen. And my father isn't a nobody from nowhere. He's Justice Antonio Reyes of the United States Supreme Court. The same Justice Reyes who's about to hear Chen Technologies versus Morrison Digital in oral arguments next month. The case that could invalidate every patent you've built your empire on." The color drained from Marcus's face. Behind him, Sienna's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to dawning horror. "You're lying," Marcus whispered. "Your father is a construction worker. You told me, I told you my family was in building things. I never specified what kind of things." Elena's smile was cold and precise. "Justice Antonio Reyes has built constitutional law for 30 years. He's the swing vote on a Supreme Court that's about to decide whether your company has been engaged in systematic intellectual property theft. And Marcus? He's very protective of his daughters. Especially his pregnant daughter who just got thrown out of her house in a thunderstorm." She climbed the stairs to the master bedroom she'd shared with Marcus for 3 years, each step feeling like a victory. Behind her, she could hear Sienna's panicked whispers, Marcus's stunned silence, the sound of their perfect plan crumbling into pieces. In the bedroom, Elena pulled out her phone with shaking hands. The number she'd memorized but never called glowed on the screen. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, warm and concerned in a way that made her throat tighten. "Elena?" "Mija," Is that you? Hi, Papa, she whispered, tears finally breaking free. I need to come home. The marble floors of the Supreme Court building gleamed under security lights as Elena Reyes sat in her father's private office, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like the cigars he pretended he'd quit smoking. Through the tall windows, she could see the Capitol dome lit against the night sky, a reminder that she was no longer in California, no longer in the life she'd tried to build separate from all this power. Justice Antonio Reyes, 63 years old, silver-haired, and currently one of the 9 most powerful judges in America, poured his daughter tea with hands that had signed opinions shaping constitutional law for 3 decades. His face, lined with age and wisdom and the accumulated weight of impossible decisions, showed no judgment. Only love, and a barely contained fury that made Elena grateful it wasn't directed at her. When were you going to tell me you were pregnant? He asked gently, setting the tea in front of her. Or married? Or apparently living under a false name for 7 years? I'm sorry, Papa. Elena's hands wrapped around the warm cup, seeking comfort in its heat. I wanted to prove I could make it on my own. Without the Reyes name opening doors or making people treat me differently. So you became Elena Reyes instead of Elena Mariana Reyes. Her father settled into the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. Changed schools, worked your way through Princeton on scholarships and part-time jobs, built a career in museum curation. All while your mother and I thought you were traveling through Europe on your trust fund. I gave the trust fund to charity, Elena admitted. All of it. I wanted to start fresh. Antonio was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter with the same intensity he brought to oral arguments. Your mother is going to have opinions about that. Strong opinions. Loud opinions in rapid-fire Spanish that will make your ears ring. Despite everything, Elena smiled. Her mother, Carmen Reyes, had been a civil rights attorney before becoming a federal judge herself. The combination of her parents' legal minds had made for a childhood filled with spirited debates about justice, precedent, and the proper interpretation of the Constitution. Where is Mama? Geneva. International Human Rights Conference. She'll be back tomorrow. Antonio's expression softened. Elena, I need you to tell me everything. Not as a Supreme Court justice, but as your father. What did that man do to you? So Elena told him. She explained how she'd met Marcus at a charity auction where she'd been cataloging pieces for sale. How he'd been charming and attentive and seemingly different from the entitled rich men who usually pursued her. How they'd fallen in love, or what she'd thought was love, and married quickly, quietly, with Marcus's lawyers handling all the paperwork. She described the slow erosion of that love. The way Marcus had started making comments about her background, her education, her lack of social connections. How he'd grown distant during her pregnancy, working late more often, taking calls in other rooms. How she'd found the hotel receipts, the text messages, the evidence of an affair he hadn't even bothered to hide well. And finally, she told her father about tonight. About the champagne glasses and the divorce papers and Sienna Whitmore's cruel laughter. About being thrown out of her own home while 7 months pregnant because her husband had decided to upgrade to a woman who better matched his social ambitions. Antonio Reyes listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively more dangerous. When Elena finished, he was quiet for several minutes, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in the gesture she recognized from countless family dinners when he was working through complex legal problems. This prenup, he said finally. Do you have a copy? Elena pulled it from her purse, the papers Marcus had thrust at her before she'd left. Antonio read through them carefully, his expression darkening with each page. This is unconscionable, he said quietly. A contract of adhesion signed under duress 3 days before your wedding, with no independent legal counsel, waiving virtually all your rights. Any competent attorney could have this invalidated. Marcus said his lawyers assured him it would hold up. Marcus's lawyers are idiots. Antonio set down the papers with barely controlled fury. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you want to fight him? Do you want to make him pay for what he's done? Elena thought about Marcus's face tonight, his absolute certainty that she was powerless. She thought about Sienna's cruel laughter, about being dragged from her home while pregnant. She thought about 6 years of making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening to a man who'd never deserved her in the first place. "Yes," she said quietly. "I want him to understand exactly what he's lost. And I want him to never be able to do this to anyone else." Antonio smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd spent 30 years crafting opinions that changed American law. "Then let me tell you about Chen Technologies versus Morrison Digital, and why Marcus Chen is about to have a very bad year." He pulled up files on his computer, documents Elena recognized as case briefs and legal memoranda. Morrison Digital filed suit 3 years ago claiming Chen Technologies stole their proprietary code to build the cloud infrastructure that made Marcus's company worth billions. The case has wound through lower courts, and now it's reached the Supreme Court. "I remember Marcus being stressed about some lawsuit," Elena said. "But he said it was frivolous, that Morrison Digital was just trying to extort money from a successful competitor." Marcus lied. "The evidence is actually quite compelling that Chen Technologies engaged in systematic intellectual property theft. Not just from Morrison Digital, but from half a dozen smaller competitors over the past decade." Antonio pulled up another document. The lower courts have been split on whether his actions constitute actual theft or just aggressive business practices. We granted cert to resolve the circuit split. Elena felt her heart rate quicken. "And you're the swing vote." "I'm the swing vote on a court where 4 justices are inclined to rule for Morrison Digital, 4 are inclined to rule for Chen Technologies, and I'm genuinely undecided based on the legal merits." Antonio's expression was carefully neutral. "At least, I was undecided until about 2 hours ago when my pregnant daughter called me from a hotel because her husband threw her out of their home." "Papa, you can't rule based on personal feelings. That's not how the law works." "You're absolutely right. Which is why I'm going to recuse myself from Chen Technologies versus Morrison Digital tomorrow morning." Antonio's smile was sharp enough to cut. "I'll cite my daughter's marriage to the defendant as creating an unavoidable conflict of interest. Chief Justice Roberts will assign one of the retired justices to sit in my place." Elena understood immediately. "Justice Morrison. Marcus Morrison's father." "The same. He retired 5 years ago after a distinguished career, but he still sits by designation for cases where conflicts arise." Antonio leaned back in his chair. "Justice Marcus Morrison Sr. has been watching his son's company get destroyed by a man who stole their intellectual property. What do you think his vote will be?" "He'll rule for his son's company. Which means Morrison Digital wins 5-4 instead of losing 5-4. Which means Chen Technologies will owe approximately $8 billion in damages and lost profits." Antonio's expression was deeply satisfied. "Plus legal fees, plus the invalidation of every patent Marcus built his empire on. His company will be bankrupted, his reputation destroyed, his business model exposed as fraud." Elena stared at her father, understanding dawning. "You were always going to recuse yourself once you learned about my marriage." "I was going to recuse myself the moment I confirmed you'd married Marcus Chen. But I wanted to wait until the most strategic moment." Antonio pulled up another file. "Your mother and I have known about your marriage for 3 years, Elena. Did you really think we wouldn't find out when our daughter married a billionaire, even under a false name? You knew? For 3 years, you knew, and you never said anything? We wanted to respect your choices. Give you space to live your life on your own terms." Antonio's voice softened. "But we've been watching, Mija. Making sure you were safe. And preparing for the day you might need us." Elena felt tears threatening again. "I'm sorry I lied to you. Sorry I hid for so long. You have nothing to apologize for. You wanted to build your own life, prove yourself on your own merits. There's no shame in that." Antonio stood and moved to the window, looking out at the illuminated Capitol. "But Elena, you need to understand something. The moment you married Marcus Chen, you became a potential conflict of interest for one of the most important intellectual property cases in decades. I've been waiting for the right moment to recuse myself and let nature take its legal course. And tonight gave you that moment. Tonight gave me the perfect moment. Marcus Chen just handed me the justification I needed. Antonio turned back to his daughter. Tomorrow, I'll file my recusal. Justice Morrison will be assigned to the case. Oral arguments are in 3 weeks, and the opinion will likely be released before your baby is born. By the time your daughter arrives, her father will be too busy dealing with bankruptcy proceedings to fight you for custody. Elena absorbed this, her mind racing through the implications. This will destroy him. This will hold him accountable for his actions. Both his illegal business practices and his treatment of my daughter. Antonio's voice hardened. Marcus Chen built his empire on stolen code and destroyed smaller competitors who couldn't afford to fight back. He deserves everything that's coming to him. A knock on the door interrupted them. Antonio's clerk, a young woman named Sarah who'd worked for him for 2 years, stuck her head in apologetically. Justice Reyes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a Marcus Chen in the lobby demanding to speak with you. Security has detained him, but he's extremely agitated and making threats about going to the press. Antonio and Elena exchanged glances. Let him up, Antonio said quietly. But have security stand by. 5 minutes later, Marcus Chen burst into the office, his Armani suit rumpled, his hair disheveled, his expression wild with panic and fury. He froze when he saw Elena sitting calmly with her father, wrapped in a blanket and drinking tea as if this were a normal family visit. You, he spat at Elena. You lying, manipulative, finish that sentence and I'll have you arrested for threatening a pregnant woman. Antonio's voice was cold enough to freeze nitrogen. Mr. Chen, I assume you're here about my recusal from your case. Marcus turned to face the Supreme Court Justice, and Elena watched realization crash over him like a wave. He was no longer talking to his discarded wife's father. He was standing before one of the 9 most powerful judges in America, in the Supreme Court building, having just committed what was probably contempt of court by his threatening demeanor. Justice Reyes, Marcus said, forcing his voice into something approaching calm. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Elena and I are going through a difficult divorce, but that's no reason for you to recuse myself from a case where I have an obvious conflict of interest. Antonio's expression was perfectly neutral. Mr. Chen, the Code of Judicial Conduct is quite clear. I cannot sit in judgment on cases involving family members or their spouses. The moment my daughter married you, I should have recused myself. That I didn't do so immediately was an oversight I'm correcting tomorrow. But you were going to rule in my favor. Marcus's panic was bleeding through now. I know you were. The conservative justices, the business-friendly bloc, you would have sided with protecting American innovation and job creation. You're assuming I'd made up my mind. I hadn't. Antonio gestured to a chair. Sit down, Mr. Chen. You're making my security team nervous. Marcus sat, his movements jerky with barely controlled desperation. Justice Reyes, please. This recusal will destroy my company. Justice Morrison hates me. Everyone knows he'll rule for his son regardless of the legal merits. Much like you're assuming I would have ruled for you regardless of legal merits. Antonio's voice was mild, but the words landed like hammer blows. Mr. Chen, if you're suggesting that Supreme Court justices decide cases based on personal relationships rather than constitutional interpretation, I'd be very careful about where you make such accusations. I'm not saying that. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, his composure crumbling. There has to be something we can do. Some arrangement we can come to. Are you attempting to bribe a Supreme Court justice? Antonio's voice could have cut glass. No. God, no. I just mean, Marcus turned to Elena desperately. Baby, please. Tell your father this is all a misunderstanding. Tell him we can work things out, go to counseling, save our marriage. Elena set down her tea with careful precision. Marcus, 3 hours ago you threw me out of our house in a thunderstorm while I was 7 months pregnant with your daughter. You called me a gold digger and told me I embarrassed you by existing. Your mistress is probably sleeping in our bed right now. Which part of that suggests I'm interested in saving our marriage? I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. Marcus reached for her hand, but Elena pulled away. Elena, I love you. I've always loved you. Sienna doesn't mean anything to me. It was just stress from the lawsuit, from the pressure of running a billion-dollar company. But we can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through our problems, be a family for our daughter. You don't love me, Marcus. You love my father's vote. Elena stood up, her movements careful with her advanced pregnancy. You're terrified that without Justice Reyes on your side, you're going to lose everything. And you're right to be terrified. Marcus turned back to Antonio, his voice taking on a harder edge. If you recuse yourself, the press will want to know why. They'll investigate, discover Elena's been living under a false name. There will be questions about why a Supreme Court justice's daughter hid her identity, about what she might have been running from. Are you prepared for that scrutiny? Are you threatening to damage my daughter's reputation? Antonio's voice was dangerously quiet. I'm pointing out the reality of the situation. Elena lied about who she was. She married me under false pretenses. Some might say she was running from something. Maybe legal troubles, maybe, careful, Mr. Chen. Antonio stood, his full height and the weight of his office making Marcus shrink back in his chair. You're in the Supreme Court building, threatening to defame my daughter with baseless accusations of criminal activity. I have 6 security officers standing outside that door who would be very interested in such threats. Marcus's face went pale. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just saying there will be questions. And I'm saying that if you attempt to smear my daughter's name, I'll ensure those questions lead to investigations into how you built Chen Technologies. Antonio moved around his desk, standing over Marcus with all the authority of his position. We both know your empire was built on stolen code. The Morrison case is just the tip of the iceberg. How many other competitors did you destroy? How many other patents did you steal? How many NDAs have you violated? How many employees have you threatened into silence? You can't prove any of that. I don't have to prove anything. I'm a Supreme Court justice, not a prosecutor. Antonio's smile was cold. But I know plenty of prosecutors. Federal prosecutors who would be very interested in evidence of systematic intellectual property theft, securities fraud, and potential RICO violations. Prosecutors who owe me favors, who trust my judgment when I suggest they should look into something. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. You're threatening to abuse your position to destroy me because I divorced your daughter. That's corruption, Justice Reyes. I'm not threatening anything, Mr. Chen. I'm simply pointing out that actions have consequences. Antonio walked to the door, opening it to reveal the security officers waiting outside. You threw my pregnant daughter out of her home during a thunderstorm. You committed adultery, violated your marriage vows, and treated the mother of your child with unconscionable cruelty. Now you're facing the natural consequences of a business built on theft and a marriage destroyed by your own actions. This isn't over, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. I have lawyers. Good lawyers. They'll fight your recusal, challenge the case assignment, appeal everything. Of course they will. That's their job. Antonio's expression didn't change. But while they're filing motions and burning through your rapidly depleting legal budget, remember this, you could have had a wife who loved you and a daughter who would have adored you. Instead, you'll have bankruptcy proceedings and a custody arrangement that ensures you see your child on my daughter's terms. Choose your next moves very carefully, Mr. Chen. After Marcus left, escorted out by security with instructions not to return without an appointment, Elena sank back into her chair. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Papa, was that ethical? Using your position to threaten him? I didn't threaten him. I informed him of reality. Antonio returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. Elena, I'm recusing myself from his case because I have a conflict of interest. That's not only ethical, it's required. What happens after that is simply the law taking its course. But you know Justice Morrison will rule against him. I know Justice Morrison will review the evidence and make his decision based on the legal merits. If that decision happens to favor his son's company, that's not my concern. Antonio poured himself tea, his movements calm despite the tension of the past hour. Marcus Chen built his empire on stolen property. He destroyed competitors, violated patents, and engaged in systematic fraud. The only reason he's gotten away with it for so long is because his victims couldn't afford to fight back. Well, Morrison Digital can afford to fight back, and they have the evidence to prove their case. And the prosecutors you mentioned? The favors they owe you? I've been a federal judge for 30 years, Elena. I know a lot of prosecutors. Some of them are friends. If I mention in casual conversation that Marcus Chen's business practices might warrant investigation, they'll look into it because they trust my judgment. Antonio met his daughter's eyes steadily. But I won't make that call unless Marcus forces my hand by attacking you. Right now, the Morrison case is enough to destroy him financially. Whether it destroys him criminally depends entirely on his next choices. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. I wanted to prove I could make it on my own. Without the Reyes name, without your connections, without any advantages. And I did make it on my own. I built a career, earned my degrees, supported myself. You absolutely did. But now I'm using your power to fight back against Marcus. Doesn't that invalidate everything I was trying to prove? Antonio leaned forward, his expression serious. Mija, proving yourself doesn't mean refusing help when someone tries to destroy you. You built your life on your own merits. Marcus tried to tear that life apart because he found someone he thought would serve his ambitions better. Fighting back against that isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Mama would say I should fight dirty. Your mother would say you should fight smart. There's a difference. Antonio smiled slightly. And she'll be back tomorrow with approximately 47 different ways to destroy Marcus Chen, most of which will violate at least 3 Geneva Conventions. I suggest we wait for her input before planning our next moves. Elena laughed despite herself, imagining her mother's fury when she learned what Marcus had done. Carmen Reyes was a small woman with an enormous sense of justice and absolutely no patience for men who mistreated women. I should sleep, Elena said, feeling the exhaustion pulling at her. The baby's been kicking all evening, probably stressed from everything that happened. Antonio's expression softened. Your old room is exactly as you left it. And tomorrow, we'll start putting together a custody agreement that ensures Marcus understands his access to his daughter is a privilege, not a right. As Elena climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, she felt the weight of the day finally settling on her shoulders. She'd walked away from her marriage, revealed her identity, and set in motion the destruction of her ex-husband's empire. In any other circumstance, she might feel guilty. But when she lay down on her old bed and felt her daughter kick against her ribs, she felt only a fierce protective love and the absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Marcus Chen had thrown away the best thing that ever happened to him. Now he was going to spend the next several years learning exactly what that mistake would cost him. The Georgetown townhouse where Elena had grown up was exactly as she remembered, warm hardwood floors, walls lined with law books and family photos, the smell of her mother's empanadas drifting from the kitchen despite the early hour. Carmen Reyes had returned from Geneva at 6 a.m., gotten the full story from Antonio, and immediately begun cooking with the focused intensity she usually reserved for destroying opposing counsel in court. Elena sat at the kitchen table, watching her mother move through space like a small, furious hurricane. At 60, Carmen retained the fierce beauty that had made her a force in courtrooms across the country. Her dark hair was now streaked with silver, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most respected judges on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So this pendejo, Carmen said, the Spanish word dripping with contempt as she chopped vegetables with slightly more force than necessary, he throws you out in a storm. While you're pregnant. With his child. Yes, Mama. And his puta mistress was there. Laughing at you. Sienna Whitmore. Yes. Carmen's knife paused mid-chop. Whitmore. As in Senator Whitmore's daughter? I believe so. Marcus mentioned she came from a political family. The look on Carmen's face was predatory. Interesting. Very interesting. She returned to cooking with renewed energy. Your father told you about the Supreme Court case? Yes. He's recusing himself today. Good. Marcus Morrison owes Antonio at least 6 favors, and his son's company deserves to win that case on the merits. Carmen pulled a perfectly golden empanada from the oven, the smell making Elena's mouth water despite her emotional turmoil. But the bankruptcy that will follow is only the beginning, Mija. We need to think bigger. Mama, I just want custody of my daughter and enough money to support us. I don't need revenge. No, you need justice. There's a difference. Carmen set a plate in front of Elena, then poured fresh orange juice with the same precision she brought to legal arguments. Eat. The baby needs food, even if you don't feel hungry. Elena took a bite of the empanada, and the familiar flavors of her childhood brought unexpected tears. She'd missed this, her mother's cooking, her father's quiet strength, the absolute certainty that this house was a safe place where she was loved unconditionally. I'm sorry I stayed away so long, she whispered. Carmen sat down across from her, reaching over to grasp her hand. You needed to find your own path. I understand that. But now you're home, and anyone who tries to hurt you will learn what happens when they attack a Reyes woman. Marcus is already learning that. Marcus Chen is about to get an education in how power really works in this town. Carmen pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts with the ease of someone who'd spent decades building a network of influential allies. I'm calling in every favor I'm owed, activating every contact I've made in 30 years of practicing law. By the time I'm finished, Marcus Chen will wish he'd treated you like the queen you are. What are you planning? Carmen's smile was sharp enough to cut. First, we make sure the prenup is invalidated. I have 3 colleagues who specialize in family law, and they owe me for cases I've helped them with over the years. They'll tear that contract apart so thoroughly that Marcus's lawyers will be embarrassed they ever tried to enforce it. The prenup waives my right to his assets. The prenup is unconscionable, signed under duress, without independent legal counsel, and probably violates California community property law in about 17 different ways. Carmen typed something on her phone. Second, we establish custody arrangements that give you primary physical custody with Marcus getting supervised visitation only. He'll fight that. Let him fight. He threw a pregnant woman out of her home. That shows lack of judgment, potential danger to the child, and a pattern of abusive behavior. Carmen's expression hardened. I'll make sure every family court judge in California knows exactly what kind of man Marcus Chen is. Elena felt something warm unfurl in her chest, not revenge, but the security of knowing she wasn't fighting this battle alone. What about Sienna? Ah, yes. The senator's daughter. Carmen's smile took on a particularly dangerous quality. I've known Edward Whitmore for 20 years. We served together on a judicial ethics committee. He's very protective of his family's reputation and very concerned about his upcoming re-election campaign. You're going to tell him his daughter is sleeping with a soon-to-be bankrupt businessman who threw out his pregnant wife? I'm going to mention in casual conversation that his daughter has been involved in a rather sordid affair that might generate negative press attention. Edward is smart enough to do the math himself. Carmen stood, moving back to the stove. And when Sienna realizes she's tied her wagon to a sinking ship, she'll distance herself from Marcus so fast it'll give him whiplash. Antonio entered the kitchen, dressed in his judicial robes and carrying a briefcase. The recusal is filed. Chief Justice Roberts is assigning Justice Morrison to the case. Oral arguments are still scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Perfect timing, Carmen said. That gives us time to get Elena settled, file for divorce in California, and establish the narrative before Marcus can spin his version of events. About that narrative, Antonio said carefully. Elena, the press is going to be interested in this story. Supreme Court Justice's daughter divorcing tech billionaire, that's news. We need to control how that story gets told. Elena felt her stomach clench. I don't want to be in the news. I spent 7 years avoiding exactly that. Which is why we're going to be very strategic about this. Carmen pulled out her laptop, opening what appeared to be a detailed timeline of events. We tell the truth, but we tell it our way. You were trying to build your own life, separate from your family's influence. You fell in love with a man who seemed genuine. But that man turned out to be abusive and unfaithful, and when you became pregnant with his child, he tried to discard you like garbage. That is what happened. Exactly. And it's a story that will generate enormous public sympathy, especially among women. Carmen pulled up several news sites. I have contacts at the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN. We can place op-eds, give exclusive interviews, shape the conversation before Marcus's PR team can spin him as the victim. Mama, I'm not using the press to destroy Marcus. You're using the press to protect yourself and your daughter, Carmen corrected. Marcus Chen built his public image on being a self-made genius, a brilliant innovator. People need to know he's also a man who committed adultery, threw out his pregnant wife, and built his empire on stolen code. That's not revenge, Mija. That's honesty. Antonio set down his briefcase, his expression thoughtful. Your mother is right. In cases like this, silence benefits the powerful. Marcus has resources, connections, PR firms on retainer. If we don't tell your story, he'll tell his version, and his version will paint you as a gold digger who's trying to exploit him during a vulnerable time. Elena looked between her parents, her father, one of the most respected legal minds in the country, and her mother, a judge who'd built her career on fighting for the powerless. They weren't wrong. Marcus wouldn't just accept defeat quietly. He'd fight dirty, and he'd use every resource at his disposal to make Elena look like the villain in their divorce. Okay, she said quietly. We tell the story. But I want to control the narrative. I want to give one interview, tell the truth, and then focus on preparing for my daughter's birth. Carmen's smile was satisfied. I know just the person. Sarah Chen at the Post, no relation to Marcus, she's been wanting to do a series on wealth inequality and how the rich exploit prenuptial agreements to leave their spouses destitute. Your story would be perfect. When? Tomorrow. That gives us today to prepare talking points, review the facts, and make sure you're ready. Carmen closed her laptop with decisive finality. And while you're doing that interview, I'll be filing your divorce petition in California. By the end of the week, Marcus Chen will be facing divorce proceedings, bankruptcy from the Supreme Court ruling, and a public relations nightmare that will destroy whatever's left of his reputation. Elena felt her daughter kick, as if the baby approved of her grandmother's fierce protectiveness. What about after all this? After the divorce is final and the custody is settled and Marcus's company is bankrupt? What then? Antonio sat down at the table, his expression gentle. Then you raise your daughter. You rebuild your career, if that's what you want. You live your life on your own terms, but this time with your family's support instead of trying to prove yourself alone. I like my life before all this. I liked working at the museum, curating exhibits, teaching people about art history. Then you'll do that again, Carmen said. The Smithsonian has been after me for years to recommend people for their board of directors. I'm sure they'd be interested in someone with your credentials and expertise. That feels like using the Reyes name. It's using your qualifications and my connections. That's how the world works, Elena. Carmen sat down across from her daughter. You proved you could make it on your own. You got into Princeton on merit, earned your degrees through hard work, built your career through expertise. Using your family's connections now isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Elena looked around the kitchen of her childhood home, at the family photos on the walls showing 3 generations of Reyes lawyers and judges. She'd spent 7 years trying to escape this legacy, convinced that the only way to prove herself was to build a life completely separate from her family's power. But maybe that had been the wrong lesson. Maybe the point wasn't to reject her family's influence, but to use it wisely. To understand that accepting help didn't invalidate her achievements, and that fighting back against injustice didn't make her weak. "Okay," she said finally. "We do this your way. We tell my story, we fight for custody, we make sure Marcus understands exactly what he's lost." Carmen leaned over and kissed her forehead. "That's my girl. Now eat your empanada before it gets cold. You're eating for two, and your daughter needs fuel for the battles ahead." As Elena ate, she felt something shift inside her chest, not just the baby moving, but a fundamental change in how she saw herself and her future. She wasn't Elena Reyes who'd run away from her family's power. She wasn't Elena Chen who'd tried to please a husband who would never appreciate her. She was Elena Reyes Chen, daughter of two of the most powerful judges in America, mother of a child who would grow up knowing her worth, and a woman who was about to remind Marcus Chen that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with money or lawyers or charm. The war was just beginning. But for the first time in months, Elena felt ready for battle. The Washington Post headquarters building gleamed with the austere beauty of an institution dedicated to truth. Elena sat in a conference room on the 4th floor, 7 months pregnant and wearing a dress her mother had chosen, simple, elegant, and expensive enough to signal she wasn't the helpless victim Marcus's PR team would try to paint her as. Sarah Chen, again, no relation to Marcus, which she'd confirmed with slightly amused emphasis, sat across from her with a recording device and a notepad. In her mid-40s, Sarah had the sharp-eyed focus of a journalist who'd built her career on exposing uncomfortable truths about wealth, power, and the ways the rich exploited legal systems to their advantage. "Just so we're clear," Sarah said, her voice gentle despite the intensity of her gaze, "this interview will run in tomorrow's edition. The headline will probably be something like Supreme Court Justice's daughter speaks out about billionaire ex-husband's abuse. We're treating this as a major story." "I understand." Elena's hands rested on her belly, feeling her daughter's movements. "I want people to know the truth about what happened. Then let's start at the beginning. You're the daughter of Justice Antonio Reyes and Judge Carmen Reyes, two of the most respected legal minds in the country. But you spent 7 years living under a modified version of your name, working in museum curation. Why?" Elena took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to prove I could make it on my own merit. When your parents are that accomplished, people make assumptions about you, that you got opportunities because of who they are, that your achievements aren't really yours. I wanted to know I could succeed based on my own abilities. So you changed your name and kept your background secret." "I didn't change my name exactly. Elena Reyes is my real name. I just didn't advertise that I was Justice Reyes's daughter." Elena smiled slightly. "I got into Princeton on my own merits. I earned my master's degree through hard work. I built my career through expertise and dedication. None of that had anything to do with my family's connections. But hiding your identity must have been difficult. It was liberating at first. People treated me like anyone else. Men who were interested in me, not my family's influence." Elena's expression darkened. "Or so I thought." Sarah leaned forward. "Tell me about Marcus Chen." And so Elena told her story. She explained how she'd met Marcus at a charity auction, how he'd seemed different from other wealthy men she'd known. How they'd fallen in love, or what she'd believed was love, and married quickly. How she'd signed a prenuptial agreement without reading it thoroughly because she'd trusted him and wanted to prove she wasn't marrying him for money. She described the slow deterioration of their marriage. Marcus's increasing contempt for her background, his affairs that he barely bothered to hide, his growing distance during her pregnancy. And finally, she told Sarah about the night he'd thrown her out. "He handed me divorce papers at our house," Elena said quietly. "His mistress was there, wearing a white dress and laughing at me. Marcus said I embarrassed him, that I wasn't sophisticated enough to be his wife, that I should leave before his daughter was born so she wouldn't be ashamed of her mother." Sarah's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. "And you were 7 months pregnant at the time." 7 months and 3 days. It was raining. I had nowhere to go because I'd isolated myself from my family for so long." Elena's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "I ended up calling my father from a hotel room, and he brought me home to Washington. What was your father's reaction? He said he'd known about my marriage for years but had been respecting my choices. He said he'd been waiting for the day I might need him. Elena smiled despite the tears threatening. And then he told me about the Supreme Court case that's about to destroy Marcus's company. Sarah's eyes sharpened. Chen Technologies versus Morrison Digital. Your father is recusing himself from that case. He has to. The conflict of interest is too obvious. Elena met Sarah's gaze steadily. But the recusal means Justice Morrison will sit in his place. And Justice Morrison's son owns the company that Marcus allegedly stole code from to build his empire. You understand that's going to look like revenge. Supreme Court Justice recusing himself in a way that ensures his daughter's ex-husband loses a billion-dollar case. I understand that's what Marcus's lawyers will claim. But my father is following the judicial code of ethics. He can't sit on a case involving his daughter's spouse. Elena's voice hardened. The fact that his recusal happens to benefit a plaintiff who has compelling evidence that Marcus built his company through theft isn't revenge. It's the law taking its natural course. Sarah was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. Elena, I need to ask you something difficult. Marcus's PR team is already circulating stories that you're a gold digger who married him under false pretenses, hid your identity, and is now using your family's influence to destroy him because he wanted a divorce. How do you respond to that? I respond by pointing out that I had a successful career before I met Marcus. I earned 2 degrees from Princeton, worked my way through graduate school, built a reputation in museum curation. I didn't need his money. Elena's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. And if I'd been trying to exploit my family's connections, I would have told Marcus who my parents were from the beginning. Instead, I hid my background because I wanted to be loved for myself. But you're using those connections now. I'm accepting help from my family after my husband threw me out of my home while pregnant. There's a difference between exploitation and accepting support when you're vulnerable. Elena leaned forward slightly. Sarah, Marcus Chen built his company on stolen intellectual property. He destroyed smaller competitors through litigation they couldn't afford. He committed adultery, violated his marriage vows, and treated the mother of his child with unconscionable cruelty. I'm not destroying him. He destroyed himself. The interview continued for another hour, Sarah asking questions about the prenup, the custody arrangements Elena was seeking, her plans for after the baby was born. Elena answered each question honestly, maintaining her composure even when discussing the most painful details of her marriage. Finally, Sarah turned off her recording device. This is going to be a huge story, Elena. Probably front page, definitely picked up by the major networks. Are you prepared for that level of attention? No, Elena admitted. But I'm prepared to tell the truth and let people judge for themselves. Marcus has resources, PR firms, lawyers who will try to spin this as me being a vindictive ex-wife. But I have something he doesn't. What's that? The truth. And a family who won't let him bury it. Elena stood carefully, her advanced pregnancy making the movement awkward. Thank you for giving me the chance to tell my story. Sarah stood as well, extending her hand. Thank you for trusting me with it. This piece is going to run tomorrow, and it's going to change the conversation about prenuptial agreements, wealth inequality, and how the rich treat their spouses when they become inconvenient. As Elena left the Post building, her father's car waiting at the curb with security that she was still adjusting to, she felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The interview was done. The story would run tomorrow. And Marcus Chen was about to discover that throwing away the daughter of 2 federal judges was the biggest mistake of his life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, divorce papers filed in California. Marcus's lawyers have been notified. How did the interview go? Elena typed back, it went well. The story runs tomorrow. Let the games begin. Carmen's response was immediate, excellent. Now come home and rest. Your daughter needs her mother to be strong for what comes next. What came next, Elena knew, would be brutal. Marcus wouldn't accept defeat quietly. There would be legal battles, PR wars, attempts to paint her as the villain. But she had something Marcus had never understood, a family who loved her unconditionally and would fight for her with every resource at their disposal. The war had begun. And Elena Reyes Chen was ready. The story broke at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, front page of the Washington Post with a headline that made Elena's breath catch: Justice's daughter alleges abuse by tech billionaire husband. Below it, Sarah Chen's byline and a photo of Elena looking composed and elegant despite her advanced pregnancy. The article was devastating in its detail: Marcus's affair with Sienna Whitmore, the night he'd thrown Elena out, the prenuptial agreement signed under duress, the Supreme Court case that would likely destroy his company. By 7 a.m., every major news network was running the story. CNN had legal experts discussing prenuptial agreements and judicial ethics. MSNBC interviewed women's rights advocates about patterns of abuse among wealthy men. Fox News was attempting to spin it as another example of liberal judges abusing their power, but even their commentators seemed uncertain about defending a man who'd thrown out his pregnant wife. Elena sat in her parents' kitchen, watching the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. Seeing her life dissected on national television felt invasive, but necessary. Her mother had been right: controlling the narrative meant getting ahead of Marcus's PR team, and this interview had accomplished exactly that. Twitter is losing its mind, Carmen announced, scrolling through her phone with obvious pleasure. Hashtag Justice for Elena is trending. So is hashtag Chen Technology scam. And someone started a petition demanding Marcus resign from his own company before the bankruptcy. He won't resign, Antonio said calmly, reading the Post article on his iPad. Marcus's ego won't allow it. He'll fight this until the bitter end. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Elena's phone lit up with an unknown California number. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to Marcus's message with her parents gathered around. Elena, what the fuck did you do? Marcus's voice was ragged, desperate. The Post? A front-page story? You made me look like an abusive monster when all I did was ask for a divorce. This is character assassination, and my lawyers say it might be grounds for a defamation suit. Call me back. We need to talk about this before it gets any worse. Carmen snorted. Defamation requires false statements. Everything you told Sarah Chen was true. Let him sue. Discovery alone will destroy whatever's left of his reputation. Elena's phone buzzed again, this time a text from a number she recognized as Sienna Whitmore's. Thanks a lot, bitch. My father is furious and cutting me off because of your little publicity stunt. I hope you're happy ruining lives. Elena showed the text to her mother, who smiled with predatory satisfaction. Senator Whitmore works fast. He must have seen the morning news and decided his daughter's relationship with a soon-to-be bankrupt CEO wasn't worth the political liability. Should I respond? God, no. Let her stew in her own misery. Carmen poured more coffee. Sienna Whitmore thought she was trading up when she stole your husband. Now she's discovering that being the other woman in a national scandal isn't as glamorous as she imagined. The house phone rang, the private line that only family and close friends had access to. Antonio answered, his expression shifting from neutral to deeply satisfied as he listened. That was Chief Justice Roberts, he said after hanging up. He wanted to give me a heads up that the media is requesting comment about my recusal from the Chen case. He's releasing a statement this afternoon confirming that I properly recused myself due to family conflict of interest and that Justice Morrison has been assigned to sit in my place. Is Morrison ready? Elena asked. Marcus Morrison has been preparing for this case since it was granted cert. His son's company has been in legal limbo for 3 years while Chen Technologies used every delay tactic imaginable. Antonio's smile was grim. Justice Morrison is more than ready to finally hear the evidence his son has been trying to present. By noon, the story had evolved beyond just Elena's divorce. Business reporters were examining Chen Technologies' history, discovering patterns of aggressive litigation against smaller competitors, questionable patent claims, and a corporate culture built on intimidation. Tech journalists were interviewing former employees who described a workplace where stealing competitors' code was encouraged and whistleblowers were crushed. The narrative Marcus had carefully constructed over 15 years, brilliant innovator, self-made genius, champion of American entrepreneurship, was collapsing under the weight of evidence that had always existed but never been properly examined. "This is bigger than your divorce now," Sarah Chen called to tell Elena around 2 p.m. "We've got 3 follow-up pieces in development. One on Chen Technologies business practices, one on how prenuptial agreements are used to exploit spouses, and one on the Supreme Court case. This story has legs, Elena. National legs." Elena felt her daughter kick, as if the baby sensed her mother's mix of emotions. "I just wanted people to know the truth about what happened. I didn't mean to start a national conversation about wealth inequality." "Well, you did. And it's about time someone did." Sarah paused. "I should warn you, Marcus's legal team is preparing a counteroffensive. They're shopping their own story to more sympathetic outlets, painting you as a woman who hid her identity to trap a wealthy man, then used her family's influence to destroy him when the marriage didn't work out. Let them try. Everything I said in the interview is documented, provable truth. Truth doesn't always win in the court of public opinion," Sarah warned. "But you've got something Marcus doesn't, genuine sympathy. People look at you, 7 months pregnant and thrown out of your home, and they see their daughter, their sister, their friend. They look at Marcus and see every arrogant rich man who thinks his money makes him untouchable." After hanging up, Elena found her mother in the home office that had once been a playroom when Elena was a child. Carmen was on her laptop, reviewing documents with the focused intensity she brought to complex legal cases. "The divorce petition is filed," Carmen said without looking up. "Marcus's attorneys have 30 days to respond, but I expect they'll try to delay. They're probably hoping if they can postpone the proceedings long enough, public attention will move on to the next scandal." "Will it work?" "Not even slightly." Carmen finally looked at her daughter, her expression fierce with protective love. "Elena, I've been a judge for 25 years. I've seen every delay tactic, every legal maneuver, every attempt to game the system. Marcus's lawyers are good, but they're not better than me. And they're certainly not better than the team I've assembled to represent you." "What team?" Carmen pulled up a document showing 5 names Elena recognized from legal journals and news coverage. 3 were partners at major family law firms, 1 was a former California Supreme Court justice, and the last was a law professor who'd literally written the textbook on prenuptial agreements. "These people owe me favors," Carmen explained. "Cases I've helped them with, connections I've made, recommendations I've given. And they all agree that Marcus's prenup is one of the most unconscionable contracts they've ever seen. We're not just going to invalidate it, Elena. We're going to use it as a case study for why prenups need stronger regulation." Elena sat down heavily, her pregnancy making the simple movement awkward. "I just wanted a divorce and custody of my daughter. This feels like it's spiraling into something much bigger." "That's because it is something bigger. Marcus Chen represents everything wrong with how wealthy men treat their spouses, like disposable property that can be upgraded when convenient." Carmen's voice hardened. "Your case is going to change how courts look at prenuptial agreements signed under duress. It's going to make judges think twice before enforcing contracts that leave pregnant women destitute. It's going to matter, Mija. Your pain is going to help other women." The doorbell rang, followed by the sound of security clearing someone through. Moments later, Elena's younger sister Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of fury and relief. "You didn't tell me you were back," Victoria said, crossing the room to embrace Elena carefully. "I had to find out from the Washington Post that my sister was getting divorced and thrown out by her asshole husband. I'm sorry, Vic. Everything happened so fast." Victoria pulled back, studying Elena's face with the same intense scrutiny their mother brought to witness examination. At 28, Victoria was a federal prosecutor in New York, following in the family tradition of using law to fight for justice. She had their mother's fierce determination and their father's analytical mind, wrapped in a package that regularly terrified defense attorneys. "I read the article. Multiple times. And each time I wanted to fly to California and personally arrest Marcus Chen for being a complete piece of shit. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. Tell me you're destroying him. Tell me you're making him pay for what he did. Papa's recusal is going to cost him his company. The prenup is being challenged. Custody arrangements will favor me. Elena ticked off the points on her fingers. And the court of public opinion has basically convicted him of being an abusive asshole. Not enough. Victoria started pacing, her movements sharp with barely contained rage. I want criminal charges. Fraud, maybe. Or abuse. Something that puts him in actual legal jeopardy. Victoria, Antonio said gently from the doorway, we're handling this properly. Through legal channels, with appropriate procedures. Properly doesn't cut it when someone hurts my sister. Victoria turned to face her father, her expression mutinous. You taught us that the law exists to protect people, to ensure justice. Well, justice for Elena means Marcus Chen facing actual consequences, not just losing money he probably stole anyway. Carmen closed her laptop with deliberate calm. Victoria, I appreciate your protective instincts. But Elena gets to decide how far we take this fight. It's her life, her divorce, her choice. All three of them turned to look at Elena, who sat with her hands resting on her belly, feeling her daughter's movements. She thought about Marcus's contempt, Sienna's cruelty, the cold rain that had soaked her the night she'd been thrown out of her own home. I want him to lose everything, she said quietly. His company, his reputation, his smug certainty that money makes him untouchable. I want him to understand that throwing away his family was the worst decision he ever made. Victoria's smile was sharp with approval. Now we're talking. What do you need from me? Your prosecutor's eye on the evidence. If there are criminal charges that could be filed against Marcus or his company, I want to know about them. Elena met her sister's gaze steadily. But we do this smart. No rushing in, no emotional decisions. We build a case that can't be dismissed or defended. I can work with that. Victoria pulled out her phone, already typing notes. I'll need access to the evidence from the Morrison case, financial records from Chen Technologies, and anything else that might show a pattern of fraud or illegal business practices. I can get you most of that through discovery in the divorce proceedings, Carmen said. Plus whatever the Supreme Court case generates. Between family law discovery and the Morrison legal team's research, we'll have access to 15 years of Chen Technologies' dirty secrets. Antonio cleared his throat gently. Before we plan Marcus's complete destruction, perhaps we should focus on Elena's immediate needs. Like preparing for a baby who's due in 6 weeks. The reminder cut through the tactical planning, bringing everyone back to the reality that Elena was about to become a mother. A single mother, raising a daughter whose father would be bankrupt and possibly facing criminal charges. I want her to have her father in her life, Elena said softly. Despite everything Marcus did to me, I want my daughter to know him. But on my terms, with my control over when and how much access he gets. Then that's what we'll fight for, Carmen said firmly. Supervised visitation, strict schedules, and the absolute right to revoke access if Marcus shows any sign of being a danger to his child. Victoria sat down next to Elena, taking her sister's hand. You know Mama and Papa would help you raise her, right? You don't have to do this alone. I know. And I'm grateful. Elena squeezed her sister's hand. But I also need to prove I can be a good mother on my own. That I can build a life for my daughter that isn't defined by Marcus's betrayal or my family's power. You don't have to prove anything, Antonio said gently. You've already proven yourself, Elena. Multiple times, in multiple ways. Now you just have to let people who love you help. As her family surrounded her, her mother with her fierce determination, her father with his quiet strength, her sister with her protective fury, Elena felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, but close enough. She'd spent 7 years trying to prove she could make it alone. Now she was learning that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. And the people who loved her were about to help her deliver justice that Marcus Chen would never forget. The war was far from over. But Elena Reyes Chen was no longer fighting alone. And Marcus was about to discover that when you threw away a Supreme Court justice's daughter, you didn't just lose a wife. You lost the war. The Supreme Court's oral arguments for Chen Technologies versus Morrison Digital were scheduled for a cold morning in late January, exactly 4 weeks before Elena's due date. She sat in the public gallery, her advanced pregnancy making the hard wooden benches uncomfortable, but her determination to witness this moment outweighing any physical discomfort. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal scholars, and tech industry observers who understood this case would reshape intellectual property law for a generation. But Elena suspected most of them were also there because of the human drama underlying the legal arguments, the billionaire who'd thrown out his pregnant wife now fighting for his company's survival before a Supreme Court that included the father of that same wife. Justice Morrison sat in the chair normally occupied by Elena's father, looking every inch the distinguished jurist. At 75, he retained the sharp mind that had made him one of the most respected legal scholars of his generation. And if his eyes held a particular intensity when looking at the Chen Technologies legal team, well, that was only natural for a man whose son's company had been destroyed by their client. Marcus Chen sat at the defense table, flanked by 4 expensive lawyers who'd been preparing for this moment for months. He looked thinner than Elena remembered, his suit hanging slightly loose as if he'd lost weight from stress. His eyes found hers across the courtroom, and something flickered in his expression, regret, maybe, or just recognition of how completely the tables had turned. The Chief Justice called the court to order, and Morrison Digital's attorney stood to present their case. For 90 minutes, he methodically demonstrated how Chen Technologies had systematically stolen proprietary code, violated patents, and built an empire on intellectual property theft. The evidence was damning: internal emails discussing borrowing competitor code, documentation of patent violations, testimony from former employees who'd been ordered to steal trade secrets. Marcus's lead attorney did his best to counter, arguing that the code similarities were coincidental, that innovation naturally led to parallel development, that Morrison Digital was simply jealous of a more successful competitor. But even Elena could see the arguments were weak, desperate, built more on legal technicalities than actual defense. The justices asked pointed questions, and Elena watched Justice Morrison carefully. He was scrupulously fair, asking both sides equally difficult questions, never showing obvious bias. But when Chen Technologies' attorney tried to claim that protecting their patents would stifle innovation, Justice Morrison's response was withering. "Counselor, are you suggesting that theft of intellectual property should be encouraged in the name of innovation? That smaller companies should simply accept having their work stolen by larger competitors with better legal resources?" The attorney stumbled through a response that satisfied no one. And when the arguments concluded 3 hours later, Elena knew the outcome was inevitable. Chen Technologies would lose. Marcus's empire would crumble. And the justice of it, the poetic, perfect justice, made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. She stood to leave, her movement awkward with pregnancy, and found Marcus blocking her path in the crowded aisle. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "Can we talk? We can talk through our lawyers, Marcus. That's what divorce proceedings are for. Please. Just 5 minutes. There's something I need to say." Against her better judgment, Elena nodded. They moved to a quiet alcove near the building's grand entrance, far enough from the crowd for privacy but public enough that Elena felt safe. "I was wrong," Marcus said simply. "About everything. About throwing you out, about Sienna, about thinking I could just discard you and move on like you never mattered. Is this the part where you apologize and expect me to take you back? No. I know you'll never take me back, and I've accepted that." Marcus leaned against the marble wall, looking more defeated than Elena had ever seen him. "This is the part where I admit that losing you was the worst mistake of my life, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life regretting it." "What happened to Sienna?" "Gone. The moment the Washington Post article ran and her father cut her off, she disappeared. Last I heard, she's in Europe somewhere, trying to restart her acting career far from the scandal. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Turns out she was exactly what you thought she was, an opportunist who saw dollar signs when she looked at me. And now those dollar signs are about to disappear. The company's bankruptcy filing goes through next week. The Supreme Court hasn't officially ruled yet, but everyone knows how it's going to go. Marcus met her eyes, and Elena saw genuine pain there. I built Chen Technologies from nothing, Elena. 15 years of my life, and it's all going to be liquidated to pay damages to Morrison Digital. You built it on stolen code, Elena said without sympathy. This isn't injustice, Marcus. This is consequences. I know. I know that now. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she remembered from happier times. But our daughter, Elena. Please don't cut me out of her life completely. I know I don't deserve to be her father after what I did to you, but I'm begging you to let me try. Elena felt her daughter kick, as if the baby was offering her opinion on her father's plea. You'll get supervised visitation. 2 hours every other weekend, with a social worker present. If you prove you can be consistent, reliable, and put her needs before your ego, we'll revisit the arrangement when she's older. That's it? 2 hours every other weekend? That's more than you gave me when you threw me out while pregnant. Elena's voice stayed calm, but steel ran underneath. You want more access to your daughter? Prove you've changed. Prove you understand that being a parent is about sacrifice and commitment and putting someone else first. Then we'll talk. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Your father's recusal, it destroyed me. You know that, right? Without him on the court, I had no chance. My father followed judicial ethics. The fact that his ethical decision happened to benefit a plaintiff with a legitimate case isn't revenge. It's justice. Elena adjusted her coat, preparing to leave. You thought you could throw me away and move on to someone better. Instead, you threw away the best thing that ever happened to you. I hope Sienna was worth it. She walked away without looking back, feeling Marcus's eyes on her until she exited the building into cold January air. Her security detail, a compromise her father had insisted on after the death threats started arriving, fell into step beside her as a black car pulled up to the curb. Inside, her mother was waiting with hot chocolate and an expression of fierce satisfaction. Justice Morrison eviscerated their arguments, Carmen said as Elena settled into the seat. The opinion will probably be released within the month, but everyone in that courtroom knew how it would go. Marcus talked to me afterward. Did he apologize? He admitted he was wrong. Asked for access to our daughter. Carmen's expression softened slightly. And what did you say? Supervised visitation. 2 hours every other weekend. Elena sipped her hot chocolate, feeling its warmth spread through her. He needs to prove he can be a father before he gets to act like one. Generous of you, considering what he did. I'm not being generous for his sake. I'm thinking about our daughter. Elena rested her hand on her belly. She deserves to know her father, even if he's flawed and made terrible choices. But she also deserves to be protected from his worst impulses. Supervised visitation accomplishes both. The car pulled away from the Supreme Court, heading back toward Georgetown and the townhouse that had become Elena's refuge. She looked out the window at Washington's winter landscape, at the city where her family had built their legal legacy, and felt a profound sense of completion. 3 months ago, she'd been Elena Chen, the discarded wife of a billionaire, thrown out of her home and left with nothing. Now she was Elena Reyes, daughter of 2 federal judges, about to become a mother, and the woman who'd inadvertently triggered the destruction of a corporate empire built on theft and arrogance. The war wasn't quite over. The Supreme Court still had to release its opinion, the divorce still had to be finalized, custody arrangements still had to be formalized. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Marcus Chen had thought he was divorcing a nobody. Instead, he'd declared war on a family that had been fighting, and winning, legal battles since before he was born. Some lessons, Elena thought as the car carried her home through streets lined with the monuments to justice her family had helped build, were worth whatever they cost to learn. And Marcus Chen's education was just beginning. The Supreme Court's opinion in Chen Technologies vs. Morrison Digital was released on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 2 weeks before Elena's due date. She read it in her father's study, the same room where she'd first called him for help, now feeling like a sanctuary where justice had been carefully crafted. Justice Morrison had written the majority opinion, 5-4, exactly as predicted. The dissent was strong, arguing about stifling innovation and the dangers of overly broad intellectual property protections. But the majority opinion was devastating in its clarity. Chen Technologies had engaged in systematic theft of proprietary code. Their patents were invalidated. They owed Morrison Digital $8 billion in damages and lost profits. And the precedent established would fundamentally reshape how courts handled intellectual property cases for the next generation. Marcus's empire was officially dead. Elena set down the opinion and felt her daughter kick, strong, insistent movements that suggested the baby was as ready for this battle to end as her mother was. 2 weeks later, Elena Reyes Chen gave birth to Sofia Carmen Reyes in the same Georgetown hospital where she and her sister had been born. The labor was long and difficult, but when the nurse placed her daughter in her arms, Elena felt every moment of pain transform into something approaching transcendence. Sofia had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. She had the Reyes family's stubborn chin and lungs that suggested she'd never have trouble making herself heard. And when Marcus came for his first supervised visit 3 days later, holding his daughter with trembling hands and tears streaming down his face, Elena felt something inside her chest that wasn't quite forgiveness but might eventually become peace. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. The prenup was invalidated, and Elena received half of Marcus's remaining assets, which, after the bankruptcy and legal fees and damages, amounted to about $12 million. Enough to ensure Sofia's future, but a fraction of what Marcus had been worth before his world collapsed. Marcus moved to Seattle and started a consulting firm, helping smaller tech companies protect themselves from the kind of predatory practices he'd once pioneered. He sent child support payments on time every month and showed up for his supervised visits with Sofia with the regularity of a man who understood he'd been given a second chance he didn't deserve. Elena returned to museum work, accepting a position at the Smithsonian that let her use both her expertise and her family's connections without shame. She raised Sofia in Georgetown, surrounded by grandparents who spoiled her shamelessly and an aunt who taught her that justice was worth fighting for. And sometimes, late at night when Sofia was sleeping and the house was quiet, Elena would think about the woman she'd been 3 years ago. The woman who'd hidden her identity because she thought proving herself meant refusing help. The woman who'd believed that love meant making yourself small enough to fit someone else's idea of who you should be. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain that her daughter would never doubt her worth or hide who she was to please a man who didn't deserve her. Marcus Chen had thrown away the best thing that ever happened to him. But in doing so, he'd given Elena Reyes the chance to find herself again. And that, Elena thought as she checked on Sofia one last time before bed, was its own kind of justice.